actually going to be talking about two women, not just Henrietta Lacks. We're going to be talking about Typhoid Mary also, because there's a book out about the life of Typhoid Mary, and they both make interesting cases. So, how many of you have read either of those books? Have you read both, or just the Henrietta Lacks? Okay, and we want this to be a discussion, and so we're going to be trying to raise questions and hope you participate as fully as you're interested in participating. But here you have a picture of both Henrietta Lacks and Typhoid Mary. Her name was Mary Mallon. You often don't hear her name at all. So we're talking about, we'll start with what is public health ethics, who are Mary Mallon and Henrietta Lacks, and what are the ethical issues involved. Okay, public health ethics is the moral foundation of public health is an injunction to maximize welfare and therefore health as a component of welfare. And so the core challenge of public health is balancing individual liberties, and that's what these are all about, is balancing individual liberties with the health of the public or good health outcomes. Okay, first we'll talk about Mary Mallon. I'm going to be talking about Mary Mallon, and Lisa will be talking about Henrietta Lacks. Okay, typhoid has been a major killer for centuries. It was a disease people were really afraid of. End of the 1800s, a lot of people were dying. I remember my grandmother had had typhoid and talked about it a lot. It's called it's bacillus, and the bacillus is found in human urine and feces. It can be stored in organs. The bacillus can be stored in organs. In the case of Mary Mallon, it was stored in her gallbladder. There are about 1,000 strains of salmonella, including the ones that are responsible for causing food poisoning, but also the ones that cause typhoid. All are transmitted by contact with humans or animal waste, and symptoms include fever, severe intestinal problems, diarrhea, listlessness, and in some cases death. Okay, Mary Mallon was a cook. She'd come over from Ireland. She came over alone as a young woman. She had no family here. She was very vulnerable. She was an excellent cook, according to all the accounts that I could read and that were included in the book. I got interested in her, and because she's a complicated character, she was an excellent cook. We think of people and having a steady job for the rest of their life. That was not true in the 1880s, 1890s. What would happen is the cook would be hired for the social season and let go. So Mary's life was really one of employment followed by periods of not being employed, followed by periods of employment. She's been accused of going into a household, deliberately giving them typhoid, and then leaving right away and going to another household. That apparently is not true. What happens is that the employment was always short. Another thing that she did that caused her problems in the community, probably, though the book didn't directly address this, is that during those periods of unemployment, she had no place to live. She had very little savings. She had no family. And she had a friend who was male, and she would go and stay in a room in his place. And that, I imagine, was really shocking in the 1890s. But, you know, all through this, I could kind of in New York, when the residents came down with typhoid, they never blamed her for the typhoid. She looked healthy, she looked robust, she had good coloring, she was full of energy, she was bright, engaged. They actually, all the families really liked her. They all defended her when push came to shove and they had to say something about her. She got another job in Manhattan the next year, and that family members also developed typhoid. They had diarrhea anyway and fever, and we assume it was typhoid. It was not been diagnosed. And the laundress in the family died. She probably fixed the food for not only the family but the help. She went to work with another family, and 7 of the 8 household members developed typhoid. And she stayed on for months to help care for those family members. Realized she must have gotten typhoid after she left Ireland and came to the United States. She got it here, but she was totally asymptomatic. If she ever had any symptoms of having gotten typhoid, and it went away, and she thought she was fine. So she took a position after that in 1904 in Long Island, and then 4 of the 10 family members were hospitalized with typhoid. By the end, 47 people, 3 of whom would die, were infected with typhoid. What had happened about that same period of time was it was the sanitation movement and public health. So the public health department in New York had already worked on the water system, and they knew the water system was good. So they were shocked when these cases of typhoid started popping up all in different parts of New York. They couldn't figure out what was going on. So there was one man who got particularly interested in that, and here's his picture. His name's George Sopler. He was not an MD, he was like a chemist, I believe he was a chemist. And he wanted to figure out where these cases of typhoid were coming from, because as we know in England, the typhoid was coming from, they traced it back to a particular pump in London, and it wasn't the water system in New York. So he followed all these cases and figured out the one person who was common was this Mary Mallon. And so he went to the house where she was working. You know, he had to figure all of this out, and there were no records at that time, so he had to track her down. I'm sure it was quite a job. And he confronted her in the house where she was working as a cook, and told her that there was a link between her cooking and people getting typhoid fever. I think that he was not very kind or patient with her, the way he interviewed her. It was like she was already tried and convicted. It sounds like the interview went that way. And she was very defensive. Because realize, here's this woman alone, vulnerable, no family. Her only way of earning a living is cooking. And he's saying, you can no longer cook because you're making people sick through your cooking. She's healthy, she's robust, and can't see it. So she cursed at him and chased him out of there. And he requested a stool sample, and she threatened him with a meat cleaver, which she's nobody's patsy. This lady's a real strong lady. And she said, look, I'm perfectly healthy. You can't say I'm making people sick. How can I be making people sick? I'm healthy. He left with the meat cleaver incident. And she, being a very bright lady, went to the best doctor in the best laboratory in New York City and took a sample of her feces and had it tested. And they came back with the results saying she was not a carrier of typhoid. So she's all the more convinced she's not the carrier. It's not her fault. And so they send a woman officer to get her. She's arrested. She's taken away kicking and screaming.
We kind of decided to add Mary Mallon because Catherine had read the book and got all excited about it, and we started thinking about some of the parallels. So it'd be good to try to, the stories are very different kinds of stories, and so it'd be great to kind of think about some of the parallels along with us, because this, as Kate mentioned, this is kind of a different seminar in that really we read the book because we were asked to talk about it in another setting and got really interested in it, and it's really just raised a whole bunch of questions that neither of us I don't think anybody has the perfect answers to them, but it's really those things that I think in public health we struggle with on a day-to-day basis. So I wanted to, so it looked like in the room, people have pretty much read it, and if you want to look at it, I brought a copy of the book, and I don't know, we have one person online, Kate? We have two? Have they read the book? Oh, have you read the book? If you would let Kate know, that would be great.
If you have questions, send them in.
So Henrietta Lacks, for folks in here, does anybody remember hearing about HeLa cells in biology? And so there's nods in the room, and it's really interesting. I think what this raises this whole issue of this thing that is tossed out that we hear about that is so impersonal. I saw somebody pop up, but I didn't see what they said. Thanks. And to be thinking about the human side of the story, and I think that's we're both faculty in social behavioral sciences, and that I think that's what we try to do a lot is think about the human side of what's going on. And so these cells are an amazing cell line that are used in labs all over the world and have been attributed with finding solutions to many, many different health public health issues like polio vaccine, and used to test the polio vaccine. And this book was written as a result of one of those situations where somebody heard that talked about in a biology class. The author is Rebecca Skloot. And I think what she said is that her instructor kind of tossed out that they were named after somebody, and who had Henny Lane or something, I think. And it kind of stirred her interest in understanding more about her story. And so this book is really that whole story. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about, if anybody hasn't read the story, catch it up, and feel free to add details since you guys have read it. So Henrietta Lacks was actually born Loretta, I forgot her name now, Pleasant, in 1920. And her parents were Eliza and John Pleasant. And she was born in Roanoke, Virginia, and was one of 10 kids. She was the ninth of 10 kids, and her mom died when she was during their 10th birth. And so as a result of the death, her dad felt like he couldn't handle all of those kids, and so at the age of 4, Henrietta and the rest of her siblings were moved to Clover, Virginia, where there were a lot of family members. And Henrietta moved in with her grandfather, Tommy Lacks. And so this is a picture of where they lived, and this upper corner is her bedroom at the time. Obviously, it was in a little better condition, we hope, at the time. And her grandfather was a tobacco farmer, and also was the caretaker for another cousin, her first cousin, David Lacks, who she would later marry. So this is a picture, their wedding picture, I believe, and she married him in April 1941. About that, and up until that time, they had been working on her grandfather's tobacco. Well, I don't know. Was it his tobacco farm, or was he working for somebody else? I can't remember. But they were working in tobacco and doing lots of really hard labor kind of work with harvesting tobacco. And so then in about 1940, right after they got married, one of their other cousins was working at the Bethlehem Steel Mill and convinced David that this would be a better opportunity for them, and so they ended up moving first David went for a while, and then they moved the whole family to work and live near the steel mill. And they ended up having 5 kids, and with the last one being born around 1950, which is with just a few months of when Henrietta had been having health issues that she was aware of and was concerned about, and finally ended up going into to Johns Hopkins to get it checked out. And after a few months, she was diagnosed with a really aggressive form of cervical cancer, and was being treated in Johns Hopkins. And that's one of the, I think, to me, one of the more touching parts of that book, or emotional parts of that book, is kind of how the treatment of the time. For one thing, being an African American at the time, it was actually kind of amazing that Johns Hopkins had treatment, but she was sent to the colored ward, what they called the colored ward, and they ended up packing like radioactive materials right into the cervix, as their way of treating them, and so they have some really kind of aggressive treatments that end up talking about burns from the insides and things like that. So after just a few months, she died at the age of 31. Now, while she was being diagnosed, they had taken some tissue samples, and the tissue samples were given to Dr. Gay. And Dr. Guy, actually I believe he pronounced it that Guy, Dr. Guy had been searching for the immortal cell line. And so there's a big bunch of detail in the book about how they've been trying to grow cell cultures. And so it was kind of standard practice that he would get any new cells that come in, and then they would try to grow it. And hers just had this amazing ability to stay alive and multiply dramatically. And so without her consent, they were given, and it was kind of standard operating procedure to do that. And the consent, she consented to treatment, but then there was no mention about what would happen in any of the tissue. And so Henrietta was buried in an unmarked grave after her death, and at 31 years old. And at this time, her family had no idea what was happening, that there were still her cells alive. But eventually, about 20 years later, her family started to become aware of the fact that this was happening. So for 20 years, cells were growing, being used for things all over the world, and the family had no idea. And the reason it kind of started raising its head is that they started to try to do research with the families, and not really letting the family didn't really know what they were doing, but they wanted them to come in and give samples to see if their tissues would do the similar kind of thing. And in fact, David, her husband, had said he didn't want to do it, and so it raised all sorts of issues and challenges. And so then they started hearing things, and people started coming to interview them about their mother's cells, and so remember that a lot of that family were really not well educated, probably had less than 6th grade education, and really was this bizarre thing. And in fact, you think about what Catherine mentioned of not recognizing germ theory. I mean, they didn't understand what this even meant, to have her cells being places. And so in fact, Henrietta's cells had been sent to space to look at how cells deal with gravity, and as well as been used for the polio vaccine. And one of the interesting things is this, if you see in this slide, they show the weighing, that's a scale, and they said if you looked at how many, if you took all the cells that were ever multiplied or grown from Henrietta's cell line, that it would weigh more than 50 million metric tons. And so that's a scale showing it compared to, like, I believe, the Empire State Building. Other estimates are that it could wrap around the world 3 times the amount. And so, as I said, so remember with cells don't weigh, virtually nothing. So the amount of cell material that has to be to get to 50 million metric tons is amazing. And so some of the things the family dealt with was this feeling that one of the main characters in the book is Deborah, who's one of her daughters. And really, for her, they would say that her mother's cells were being sent to the moon or sent up in space. She felt like that was her mother being sent, and that when they're being tested on for HIV vaccines and polio vaccines, that that she felt like her mother was experiencing that pain and all of the suffering related to those illnesses. And so it was very emotional for her and very traumatic for her. And the other thing to be thinking about is the fact that their family was incredibly poor, many of which had not great health and had no access to health insurance, had no medical treatment. And these cell lines, the way cell lines work is initially the cells were distributed free by this Dr. Guy who he would have them, and he was just looking for ways to advance medical science, I think. But eventually, the way it works is somebody gets it and then puts a patent on it or monopolizes it and then makes major profits on it. And so millions and millions of dollars have been made on these cell lines because they've done some things where there's slight adaptations and then some company controls them. And so it was really, I think, hard for that family to start to see that people were making lots of money off of their mother and they didn't even know it was happening. So here's a timeline that you probably can't read very well, but it shows all the different things that happened as a result of Henrietta's cell lines. And so things like, I think I already mentioned polio, but there's been it's helped to develop medicines to fight cancer, the flu, Parkinson's, and research that has led to gene mapping and cloning. Her cells were used to test the effects of atomic radiation and sent into outer space. And lots of, for example, here's a quote from a microbiologist who says, I think we owe a lot of gratitude for what Henrietta provided. There's absolutely no doubt about that. And in 2011, Popular Science Online declared Henrietta Lacks as the most important woman in medical history. And so there has been a huge impact based on these cells. And so I think that the front story is really the benefit to medical science. And I think what we wanted to kind of bring back is what's the backstory about how the ethics of how this happened, maybe not necessarily aimed at Henrietta, but her family, and what are the ethical issues? Maybe there's not a problem, but it's worth thinking about. So some people have stated that that there was a complete and total injustice done to her family to obtain these cells because of the fact that there was no consent raised.
And they did ask her husband, and he said no.
Right. Initially, was that at the very beginning, or was that later on?
Later.
So now I wanted to raise some questions. So how do we think this differs, how Henrietta was treated and how this all occurred? How would that differ today compared to what happened in 1951? It is still currently not the case that they have to tell you where they're doing with their cells. And that is really interesting because I think most people assume that. And the point is also that they don't have to tell you if somebody's going to profit off of the cell line either. And so if you think about any surgeries anybody's had, and that tissue that is disposed of, it's you don't know where it goes. And so that's what was really interesting to me, because I thought between 1950 you think, oh, how horrible, it's been used and taken on. In fact, there have been some lawsuits that have tried to battle the patenting of cell lines, because there have been several other cases where people have fought that battle because of the fact that the argument can be made that if we restrict what can be done with the cells, then that may hamper scientific breakthroughs, and that's what people are arguing. And then the argument is then on the flip side, if somebody takes it and patents it, then that really restricts what can be done. And there was one cell culture that was done that way, and it would cost like $10,000 for a vial of materials, and it was just outrageously expensive. And it was it was something like for Parkinson's, and so it was almost to the point where nobody could afford to do any work on it because they had the price. So what else? Do we think anything else would be different between the 1950s and today? Hopefully her treatment would be different, right? I don't think there would be quite, hopefully, scorching and burning holes in her.
I wonder if there's a difference.
Well, it makes sense because when we do research studies and we gather, like you said, when we're gathering the samples, I've worked on projects where we took blood samples and said specifically what was going to be done with that. And then people would come to you and kind of go, oh, you've got samples stored, can we use those? And we really couldn't. And so in one situation, I had so many people coming that I ended up disposing of the materials because I said, I've just got to get rid of it because they keep saying, oh, it's okay, it's in the, you said, and other nutrient analysis. I'm like, but you're not talking about a nutrient analysis, you're talking about something else. And so and it was interesting that I finally went, okay, we're going to go deal with it, because you could see eventually it would come back. I also wondered in this book, when I read the book, how would the situation have been different for Henrietta if she was a wealthy white woman? Do we have thoughts on that?
Probably would have been different.
Well, and how? Because that's my first reaction is you would think it would be different. But I couldn't quite come up with how it might be different. Maybe the treatment would be a little different in Johns Hopkins.
Yeah, I don't know how they treated other people. I guess I don't, because they
Yeah.
separated her out, obviously, to a color.
Right.
Or, I mean, just historically, some of the stories they did to people of
Right.
in different countries and of different backgrounds. So I assume it's something different.
Right. Well, and one of the thoughts that does come up for me in the book is one of her daughters, I believe her name is Elsie, had some disabilities at birth, and they ended up putting her into a, what would we call them? It's like an asylum, we would call them back then. And some of the things that are touched on in the book get really scary about the fact that they used those folks, it looked like, for experimentation on things that seemed pretty horrific. And so that you look at and you think, yeah, a wealthy person's kid would not probably have been subjected to that, because they would have private, they might have been put away into some sort, because they were hidden away, I think, a lot of the times, but may not have been subjected to some of that kind of experimentation. And the other thing is it's probably a pretty tight, the elite would be a tighter group, and so there may have been that conversations happening, and the family may have been involved in, well, there would have been more education, so there would have been eventually more awareness as tissue lines and things evolved, to be aware of this is a money-making opportunity. And I don't want to make it about the money, because there have been several interviews with the family members who really they're not trying to get money out of it. They're not saying that the whole point of this is to go after money. The point really is this disconnect between the fact that we have no medical care and then there's millions of dollars out there. And so they've actually, as a result of the book, started a foundation to try to do something for the family so that there's some rewards going back, and to help with education and medical care for the family. And so I think it's really an interesting issue. I think, when I raised that question, I'm not necessarily sure it would, like you said, it would have been hugely different. And as you said, so this was all happening right around the times of the Nuremberg trials and things. So it was right in the same time frame where we didn't worry about vulnerable populations prior to that. But obviously World War II raised that issue pretty heavily. And so, and after that, we start to have way more concern about vulnerable populations. Well, one thing that's interesting that her cells were also used to test the HPV virus, I believe, which is the link to cervical cancer, which, that cycle of actually being a major player in helping to find a cure, or at least a vaccine for that. And so that's really kind of ironic. But then, so that said, HPV is transmitted as an STD, right? So you could also argue maybe who knows where that was picked up from? And so, yeah, maybe staying in Clover, if the whole family stayed in Clover, I don't know. So that's lots of going way out on a limb there as far as assuming she got it from her husband, who got it from somewhere else, so I don't know.
That's what I always assumed.
Yeah.
She was too busy having babies.
Didn't the book discuss that he was very promiscuous?
I think so. I was thinking that it didn't. I think they said he had STDs.
Yeah.
Oh, she was also, was it, didn't they had her, she was treated for STDs prior to her
Syphilis or
last
something.
pregnancy. Yeah, syphilis or. So, it's really interesting. But I think this thing back to individual, so back to the definition at the beginning about individual rights versus the collective good. Do we think, I mean, so it seems to me the cells being taken from Henrietta have been major impact on the collective good. And so the benefits definitely outweigh the challenges, the problems. Mary Mallon, on the other hand, I'm not sure how much the individual, the greater good was impacted by, maybe saved a few people's lives, a small handful, but not a large number. Well, on that happy note, well, thank you very much.
Thank you. Very good. Yeah.